Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kris White with the American Battlefield Trust, and I'm really excited to be outside of Tunnel Hill, Georgia. We're outside of the Western Atlantic Railroad Tunnel, which is a really iconic site just outside of Chattanooga. If you've been following along with our Chickamauga, Chattanooga video so far, we're following chronologically. We're moving our armies down through Tennessee. Now we're going to be heading down into Georgia. We've been over to Ringgold, talking about the fight of Pat Claiborne over there, and now we're really starting into the crux of the 1864 Atlanta campaign. We're in the very, very early stages of a coordinated federal effort to start applying pressure across the Southern Confederacy. There's a new guy in charge of all the federal armies, a man you may have heard of named Ulysses S. Grant. He has proven himself time and time again at places like Shiloh, Vicksburg, and now here at Chattanooga. He's eventually knocked up to command of all Union armies. We'll have one of our experts on here to talk about that. We have reorganizations in both of the Western Confederate and Union armies, the Confederate Army of Tennessee, as well as a new military district that was created during the Chattanooga campaign who has a new commander, and his headquarters aren't too far from where we're standing. We have a lot to talk about. We're going to go inside of this iconic tunnel on the Western Atlantic Railroad. This is actually a rail line that is going to run from Chattanooga down to Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, when we finally get down there, think of Atlanta like a clock, and we're roughly on that rail line of the Western Atlantic coming off around the 10 or 11 o'clock on that clock coming up towards us here into the northwest. There's 4 rail lines running into Atlanta. This will be one of the most important, and it's going to be fought over time and time again during that 1864 Atlanta campaign from May into the city's capitulation in September of 1864. So I want to introduce our first guest. I'm really excited. We got Chris Bukowski behind the camera, but I'm going to invite back Will Green. Will is our resident expert here in Chattanooga. He's up on Walden's Ridge overlooking the city of Chattanooga high from his perch. So I want to turn it over to Will. Will, where are we here in 1864? We've had Chattanooga secured by federal forces as an important rail center. It's going to be a supply center, and it's going to be a base of operations for a new player in the Union High Command, taking over all this Western armies, a guy that is loved in the North, maybe hated in the South.
Maybe so. Billy Sherman, of course, is who we're talking about. And Sherman has replaced Grant in command of all the Western theater here. He has put together what we would call in modern times an army group. Now, that's not a Civil War term, but Sherman will have 3 armies, the same 3 armies that were involved, peripherally at least, in the Chattanooga campaign, but with some new leaders. When Sherman rises to the command of the military division of the Mississippi, his replacement in command of the Army of the Tennessee is James B. McPherson. George Thomas remains in command of the Army of the Cumberland, and John M. Schofield will replace Burnside in command of the Department and Army of the Ohio. Now, it's called an army. It's really only one corps. Sherman has a force of almost 100,000 soldiers involved in the operation designed to move against Atlanta, as Kris explained, because of its importance as an industrial center and a communications transportation center. And that's really, transportation is why we're standing right here now. In 1836, the state of Georgia was interested in linking by rail its port at Savannah with the navigable Tennessee River at what was then Ross's Landing, which would soon become the city of Chattanooga. And in order to do that, they needed to get a line from the Piedmont of Georgia, where railroads were coming in from Augusta and from Savannah, and connect it with the Tennessee River up at Ross's Landing. They chartered this railroad in 1836. Now, we keep talking about Atlanta. There was no Atlanta. The terminus of this railroad, the southern terminus, would be at a place that was called Terminus, go figure, and it would run up through northwest Georgia and connect with the Tennessee River at Rossville. 1836, it was chartered. Construction began a couple of years later. It proceeded, although interrupted from time to time by the Panic of 1837 and other issues. But by 1848, the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which was now terminus at Marthasville and then the city of Atlanta, was complete except for a stretch right here at Chitagutta I can never pronounce that correctly, mountain, which is the high ground that you see right in front of us here. And in order to get through this mountain, they were going to have to build a tunnel. Now, the engineers realized that they needed a tunnel for many, many years. This was not a surprise to them, but various economic factors precluded them from constructing the tunnel until July 15th, 1848. And when they finished in May of 1850, it is safe to say that this was one of the engineering marvels of the mid-19th century, the longest tunnel in the South and a spectacular success. And the construction of this tunnel and the way that it has been preserved has just been wonderful by Whitfield County here. And in order to talk a little bit more about that, it's my privilege to introduce the historian here at Tunnel Hill, Mr. Dave Thomas. Dave?
Glad to have you guys here today. Again, as Will mentioned, the tunnel is constructed between July 1848 and October 31st, 1849, with some things to be completed, and the first trains using the tunnel May 9th, 1850. The tunnel is 1,477 feet long, and we'll be going in shortly and talking about some of the features of the tunnel. I would like to back up. Primarily, the guys here today are talking about Sherman in 1864. I'd like to back up a couple of years to April 12th, 1862. The great locomotive chase comes through our tunnel. Andrews Raiders, they've stolen a train, the General, down at what is today Kennesaw, Georgia. Their plan is to burn railroad bridges. There's 11 wooden bridges between Resaca and Chattanooga. They get chased by William Fuller and some railroad men and some Confederates, and that chase comes through our tunnel. Now, by the time they come through our tunnel, the General is running out of fuel, and the Texas is closing ground on them. The General will make it up the track 8 more miles to Ringo, Georgia, and another 2 miles past that, come to a stop, runs out of fuel, and the Raiders scatter.
Yeah, and that's one of the most famous stories out of the American Civil War, one of those antics. Big Shanty is what Kennesaw was known at the time. So they what ends up happening is, and Dave, these are the days before railroads have restaurant cars on them. So you have to pull off to the side to refuel, let your passengers have a meal. So what do these Andrews Raiders do? They come and ruin Fuller's lunch.
His breakfast.
Steal his train, take off, and to me, making light of a serious situation, I always imagine this is kind of like the Wile E. Coyote trying to run up and catch up, because he starts out on foot, gets on a hand car, starts getting on there, has to get on foot again, gets one outdated train, gets another train, then finally gets to Texas and chases them for 87 miles backwards?
Yes, running the Texas in reverse.
Yes, so we have the tender car and the Texas coming in reverse. You have coming up here, the General with about 3 box cars. They actually let the passenger cars go down at Big Shanty, let those behind. And the Raiders they're not like Sherman's Army in 1864. They really don't have the capacity to tear up the railroad.
Right.
They're being chased.
They've picked up a few hand tools along the way that doesn't help a lot in pulling up the rails. Of course, rails could be replaced pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. As I said, their primary goal is to burn bridges. Unfortunately, it's pouring rain that day. Surviving raiders will write that it's pouring buckets the day of the raid, and I think it has rained 5 days previous to the raid. So you can imagine those wooden bridges, they're pretty soaking wet, and the wood that the raiders have gathered to burn the bridges with, those are wet also. And so that's what primarily blows the plan, as much as being chased. The soaking wet bridges refuse to burn.
So they're being thwarted by Fuller and Mother Nature is essentially disarming them.
And guys, if any of you want to study a little something about the Andrews raid, There's a wonderful museum in Kennesaw, the Southern Museum of Locomotive and Civil War History, which talks about the raid. And then the monument that marks the spot where the raid ended is up in an obscure place just north of Ringgold. There's a little monument at the side of the road. I'm not sure that many Civil War people know about that, but you can find it pretty easily, and you can basically trace the entire route of the raid.
It's mile marker 116.3 for useless Civil War information for you. That's how far they made it. And it's interesting. Will actually mentioned the Southern. We're actually heading there later in our trip, so you'll be able to check out the Texas. You'll also see the General, because we're heading down to the Atlanta History Center. So we're going to hit some of those places. Dave, we want to walk inside this tunnel. And the first thing that I think of, okay, we're trying to burn bridges. We're also, during the 1864 Atlanta campaign, trying to slow down Sherman's army. And this railroad is going to be a key component to both armies. Why is the tunnel still here? Why didn't the Confederates blow it up?
My thoughts are the Confederates think they're going to retake this area, and they will need the railroad tunnel for their supplies going back toward Chattanooga.
Plus, it's pretty tough to blow up this tunnel. And what they did when Sherman's forces arrived here on May the 7th, 1864, they discovered to their delight that the tunnel was intact. What the Confederates had done is they had removed all the rails. And one theory, which may or may not hold water, is that the Confederates were hoping that the Federals would run a train into the tunnel, not knowing that the rails were gone. The locomotive would, of course, derail and block the tunnel for a large period of time. But it didn't take the Federals very long to relay these rails. And they would use this tunnel for the rest of their campaign to Atlanta.
So let's take a walk inside. Dave, now the construction of this tunnel takes place, as Will pointed out, in the 1840s. Opens up to the first rail car in 1850 in May.
Yes.
So how are we going to construct this tunnel? So are we going to have one team on the western side, one team on the eastern side, we meet in the middle?
The crews are primarily Irish immigrants. One crew starts at this end of the mountain, one crew at the other end, and they're digging toward each other. Now this crew coming as where we're standing, they have the hardest work, and we'll point that out and talk about that a little farther into the tunnel. This crew will dig out 575 feet of the tunnel. The crew coming from the other end, they will dig out 902 feet.
It's interesting that Dave mentions that it's Irish workers who do this. You might think that here in the South that they would have slaves doing the hard labor in here, but the local slave owners realized what a dangerous task this was, and they didn't want to risk losing any of their human property in constructing this tunnel. And no offense to the Irish, but apparently they weren't as valued as the slaves were in the 1840s.
Yeah, as we come through here, the two crews will try to meet in the middle. I'm from Pittsburgh, and we have a lot of tunnels in Pittsburgh, and that's how they build a lot of the tunnels there. One crew starts on one side, one starts on the other. But in one instance in one of our tunnels, they missed each other, so they had to put a slight turn to meet up in the middle. But this tunnel, more than 1,400 feet long, 1,477 feet long, they actually met in the middle. It's not very wide. If you're watching, 12 and a half feet, Will just said off camera. So we're not talking about a wide berth for any sort of a train. It's not actually that high of a tunnel. Remember, this is an archway. This is one of the strongest pieces of architecture, and I don't even see in some parts of the tunnel actually anything holding them together other than gravity, but other parts you can actually see the mortar. But it's interesting, Dave's standing beside something here 12 and a half feet wide. If you're stuck in this tunnel, if you're a worker, what do you have to do, Dave?
We have a safety pocket, or some folks refer to it as a hidey hole. He's going to step in there. There are 8 of these in the tunnel. 6 are the smaller version. We have 2 that are about 3 times this size. Now, as was mentioned, railroad workers would walk through the tunnel between trains, as would town folks. It was easier to walk the tunnel between trains than to go over the mountain. So if you're in the tunnel for any reason and a train came in, this is where you would want to be.
And this is a single track system, correct?
Yes, single track. The track was about the width of our path here today. So you can imagine, if you look at the sides, there's not a lot of room to stand and get out of the way of the train. The trains were doing about 25 miles an hour, and on the old tracks, the old cars rocked back and forth. So if you were standing here against the wall, those train cars are going to rock toward you.
All right, let's take a little bit walk down, and you had a few things to show us along the walls.
Yes, now we'll stop right here briefly. Solid rock, this is what's left of the solid rock. The crew working this in, they keep hitting solid rock or bedrock, and so they've got to remove that. They're using hand tools. The two-man hand drill, we have a good little drill mark there. So they are drilling away rock, but they are also drilling holes in the rock that they will fill with black powder, light that with a fuse, and blast the rock. Dynamite does not come along for another 20 years. So they're using black powder or gunpowder, lighting that with a fuse, blasting rock, even more dangerous than a stick of dynamite.
That's true. If you've ever worked with black powder, it's very volatile. And you have to remember, whenever you start digging inside of a mountain or you get down into a mine, you have to start dealing with Mother Nature, and we're dealing with a lot of moisture. You may have heard earlier in this video, you might have heard some running water. There's a lot of moisture that's associated with these types of tunnels. You can sometimes see that creeping through the tops. That's where you get, stalactites and stalagmites showing up in many of our caverns if you go around. This is a pretty impressive one you pointed out, Dave.
We here at the museum like to call this our best drill mark. This gives you a good idea of the size of the two-man hand drill that they are using. And then right here is a larger boulder that this crew hit. And so they've got to drill, blast through this. If you look down, you can see how long this rock extends. Now, of course, it would have come out where they needed to lay track. And another good little drill mark right here.
And it's interesting too. We have the tunnel here, but this had to be a tough railroad to work on, period, because there's a lot of bridge lines, what they call mountains in this area coming up through here. So this system, this rail system, this wasn't one that's built for a lot of speed. This one's built just to pull for power.
Right, and it was referred to as one of the curviest railroads in the country. And a lot of that is due to the hills, the creeks, the rivers running through the area. And also the railroad, they want to keep the roadbed grade at least 1%. The trains could pull a little above that grade level, but could pull fewer cars. So they're trying to maximize the amount of freight and cars that they can move. And that's part of the reason for tunneling here. Keep the roadbed at a 1% grade. And also they're trying to line up the track with Ringo Gap.
So remember what Will said at the beginning here. We're talking about Atlanta. Atlanta is the ultimate goal of William T. Sherman, but Atlanta is also a supply and rail center for the Confederacy. So whenever you're bringing supplies up the Western and Atlantic, that's what's going to help supply Braxton Bragg's, then Joseph Johnston's Army of Tennessee up in this area. Will, do you have anything that you'd like to add about this?
I would just say that this Western and Atlantic Railroad, if you're studying the Atlanta campaign, this is the critical aspect of the campaign. Because as Kris says, both armies are going to depend on this single track line for their supplies. Civil War armies aren't like pieces on a game board. They just move around at will. They have to have tons and tons of supplies every day for the horses, for the mules, the ammunition, the food, everything. And without the rail line, these campaigns would not be possible. So as we study the Atlanta campaign throughout these videos, there'll always be references to the Western and Atlantic Railroad. I can't think of a campaign in the Civil War that was more dependent on one rail line than the Atlanta campaign.
And Will, if you look at maps, if you lay out a map and look at the troop movements and the battles between Dalton, Georgia and Atlanta, it's all fairly close to this railroad line. Absolutely. Very seldom do they venture very far from the railroad. It's supplying both armies.
Yeah, and Sherman actually had been in this area prior to the war. He knows this area actually fairly well. And prior to the campaign, Montgomery Meigs and others in the transportation department of the United States Army actually are going to prefabricate the replacements for portions of this rail line, specifically bridges. So if the Confederates do destroy a part of it, they can turn back to Chattanooga, the Federals, and bring stuff down. So the logistics of this campaign, I think that's the difference between the overland campaign of '64 versus Atlanta. I think it's manpower versus logistics when you look at overland campaign versus Atlanta. I don't know if you disagree, Will.
I agree. And speaking of the Atlanta campaign, maybe we should step back out into the sunshine and talk real briefly about the beginning of the campaign, which is also a story of Tunnel Hill.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're with the American Battlefield Trust. We're with Dave Thomas and Will Green. Kris Mikowski's behind the camera. We're in the Western and Atlantic Railroad Tunnel here at Tunnel Hill. We're just across the Tennessee-Georgia border, inside of Georgia. So if you ever get a chance to, you can head over to their website. Dave, what's your website?
The website is civilwartunnel.com. We have a nice little museum here, the Western and Atlantic Railroad Tunnel and Museum.
And they're not open on Sundays. Dave's come out on his day off to give us special access, so we really appreciate him doing that for us. And this is really a cool site you can come out to and visit yourself. This is a lot of history. As Will pointed out, we have Atlanta campaign. As Dave pointed out, we have Andrews Raiders. Buster Keaton himself would be proud for us to be down here talking about the Andrews Raiders. And like we said, we're going to learn more about Andrews Raiders when we head down towards Atlanta, head down towards Kennesaw as well. But the Atlanta campaign really does kick off just outside of Chattanooga. The two armies kind of faced off against one another, kind of in a staring match for most of the winter. There is a small battle out in this area. Grant's going to order George Thomas to come out here for a reconnaissance. But, the larger story is the Atlanta campaign itself. So, Will, why don't I kick it over to you?
Well, as Sherman begins the campaign, leaving from a variety of different places, don't think of the Army groups here all concentrated in one spot. They all started at a wide a range of 30 miles apart. The Schofield's army on the left, Thomas's army in the center, and McPherson's army on the right. And on May the 7th, the Federals began to approach Tunnel Hill in the form of a brigade led by one of the fighting McCooks, Dan McCook's brigade of the Army of the Cumberland. Now, there were a handful of Confederates, cavalry, primarily cavalry, out in front of Tunnel Hill, about 2 miles to the southeast of Ringgold. And on the 7th, those Confederate cavalry began skirmishing with the advance of McCook's brigade and the other brigades in Jefferson Davis's division. And they, of course, would retreat, they would stop, they would fire. The Federals would get into line of battle. They would disperse the Confederate cavalry until they got within about a mile of Tunnel Hill. At that point, the Confederates had a couple of pieces of artillery that they were firing at the advancing Federals. McCook stopped, and the other two brigades of Davis's division joined them. And, of course, at that point, the Confederate cavalry realized they were completely outgunned, and they departed back to the Dalton area where General Johnston had prepared his defenses on Rocky Face Ridge, which is going to be the subject of our next video. Now, they were really, so the Battle of Tunnel Hill, there's casualties here that are less than 100. It's not much of a battle, but it does mark the beginning of the campaign, and Sherman will, of course, make his headquarters here at the Clisby Austin House, which you can see on another of the videos here, and would ride forward every day 3 miles or so to his command post in front of Rocky Face Ridge to oversee his plans to defeat Johnston there outside of Dalton, and then return here to Tunnel Hill at night and prepare his orders for the next day. Very briefly, the plan that Sherman would have for defeating Johnston's strong position on Rocky Face Ridge went like this. Schofield's army, coming down straight from the north, from Red Clay, Tennessee, towards a position called the Crow Valley, would be threatening Johnston's position, which was sort of like an L, with the Confederates on Rocky Face Ridge from south to north, and then turning to the right to go across this Crow Valley, and then turning to the right again on something called Hamilton Mountain. So Schofield was going to threaten the Confederate position in the Crow Valley. Thomas had a diversionary assignment too. Thomas's largest army of the Cumberland, by far the biggest of the three armies, would threaten Rocky Face Ridge from its southern position around a place called Dug Gap all the way to the northern end of Rocky Face Ridge, including the gap in the ridge through which the Western Atlantic Railroad ran and the wagon road ran, called Mill Creek Gap. Those would be all diversionary attacks, threatening attacks. The real action item in Sherman's plan was McPherson's Army of the Tennessee, which was assigned to go on the right through a gap in two of the parallel ridges to Rocky Face, Horn Mountain and Johns Mountain, a gap called Snake Creek Gap. And then once through that gap, McPherson was to turn to the east along the banks of the Oostenaula River, capture the railroad bridge over the Oostenaula at a town called Resaca, forcing Johnston to abandon his position on Rocky Face Ridge and fight for his supply line along the Western Atlantic Railroad. And that is the real first combat, the serious combat in the Atlanta campaign, and we'll be going there to talk about that in our next video.
Yeah, that was a great summary there, Will. And just comparing the Overland campaign with the Atlanta campaign, Sherman's going to go around the right, always go around to his right, Johnston's left, whereas Grant's going to go around to his left and Lee's right, is how it's always going to kind of go down. So it's an interesting juxtaposition whenever you look at the two. But with that, I think we're going to get ready to head off to our next site. Dave Thomas, I want to thank you for being a part of this.
We enjoyed it.
Hope that you head over to the Civil War Railroad.
Civil War Tunnel.
CivilWarTunnel.com, and we'll put that up on the website up on the video for you. We hope that you can head out here to the Western Atlantic Railroad Tunnel. It's really cool. You can walk through it yourself, take pictures, and really check it out. Will Green, thanks for always being here for us. We really appreciate your insights. We'll see Will with a few more videos with us, and thank you, Kris Bukowski, behind the camera there. On behalf of the American Battlefield Trust, I'm Kris White. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting Battlefield Preservation.